This is Star Wars, released in 1987 for the Nintendo Family Computer courtesy of NAMCO. This is a Japanese exclusive release, not to be confused with the JVC LucasArts Beam software release on the Nintendo Entertainment System that would come along a couple years later. Star Wars puts you in control of a black-haired Luke Skywalker, a farm boy on the desert planet of Tatooine who had his astromech droid stolen by Jawas. As such, you'll have to traverse the Dune Sea and raid the Jawa Sandcrawler so that you could rescue R2-D2 from the evil Darth Vader, who has the ability to change forms, whether it be a scorpion, a thing, or some other overly exaggerated cartoon animal. Once that's done, you play a bit more level before eventually reaching the exit, which involves flying the Millennium Falcon to another planet, where you can rescue another one of your friends, and maybe somewhere along the way will actually follow the plot of the movie that this game is supposed to be based on. Okay, so the narrative is a little whack, that's fine. I don't mind a narrative that twists the source material somewhat, so long as the gameplay is good. In that regard, however, that's the tricky bit, isn't it? Luke's default weapon is his father's Jedi lightsaber, normally an elegant weapon for a more civilized age, but in this Star Wars game, it is a weapon with questionable hit detection that requires the player to be dangerously close to enemies to have a remote chance of even landing a killing blow. This risk is compounded by the fact that one hit is all it takes to kill Luke, and it's back to the beginning of the level for you. And there are no continues once all your lives are exhausted, unless you have enough crystals, of course. The majority of Star Wars is a side-scrolling platformer where you fight off enemies, navigate the game's somewhat awkward level design, and save your friends who will join you and provide you with various things, whether it be negotiating with the locals to progress onwards or providing you with helpful information. Assuming you know the language, of course. Along the way, you'll find these Force Crystals that will provide you with the means of powering your Force powers. Somewhat simple abilities such as levitation, weapon enhancement, time stoppage, and other bits and bobs that might violate whatever canon is currently in operation, but who cares? You could also grab a blaster along the way, which is a nice long-range weapon, but you can't swap weapons, so it replaces your lightsaber, and that's not a good idea for trying to save the princess and the Death Star, since you need the lightsaber to unlock the screws Control is another hurdle in Star Wars. Luke has somewhat of a slippery feel when he's walking, but it's the jumping that's somewhat detrimental to the overall experience. When Luke jumps from a standing position, they're not very high and they don't cover much ground, but if he jumps while moving, his jumps will have a little more height. And learning this is crucial to survival in Star Wars, but you also have to account for the general wonkiness of the jumps, which don't always work as intended and feel a bit floaty as well. This makes navigating the game's precision platform-heavy levels more difficult than necessary to add to the game's already overwhelming challenge. And while you have a number of force powers to help you in a bind, they burn through crystals quickly and you have to get more to power said force abilities. On the flip side, however, a significant number of crystals are required to continue after a game over, so in between levels of side-scrolling platforming, you get to fly the Millennium Falcon and do battle against TIE fighters and even the oddball TIE Advance X1. B button shoots lasers, while A button raises shields that defend the ship against enemy fire. Much like in the regular levels, one hit can down your ship. These space battles are adequate and provide a nice break from the usual gameplay, but after a while starts to get repetitive in that they almost never change their approach. The only thing that really changes is the planet or space station in the background. Even the one X-Wing stint in this style is pretty much the same deal. Once you get past all the planetary sidetracks, orbital TIE battles, and the various morphing Vaders, you finally get to fly your X-Wing down the Death Star trench. It's your standard vertical scrolling shooter thing where you fly your X-Wing up the trench, shooting down TIE fighters and avoiding the eventual collision with walls, all the while collecting icons that will freeze your timer above. Yes, you're being timed here, and if you don't make it, well, there goes the Rebel base. Although considering that last level that takes place in said base, the Empire is probably doing the galaxy a favor. The trench run operates somewhat like a driving game where you pass checkpoints to add time to your clock, although unlike the rest of the game when you die, you continue where you left off and have a brief moment of invulnerability to get yourself in position, and do it quickly because there's a tendency to respawn in solid matter and, well, you know. As frustrating as the level gets the closer you get to the target area, this trench run is actually somewhat enjoyable, and while I failed to stop the Death Star from killing the rebellion, this was probably the most functional and logical part of this Star Wars adventure. for whatever that's worth. In terms of visuals, Star Wars is adequate but not mind-blowing. The recreation of the opening sequence is pretty good, and the cutscenes of the Millennium Falcon flying into planets is simple yet functional. But when it comes to the gameplay portions, simple is perhaps the top descriptor used here. There are a couple odd quirks here and there: black-haired Skywalker, midget stormtroopers, cartoon monsters, but the overall graphics are on par with other Famicom titles of the time. They're clean looking, they're adequate, the space battles are somewhat nice looking with TIE fighters doing little spins and stuff. The trench with the checkpoints and painted numbers is a bit ridiculous, but considering the rest of the game, it fits right in. It's a rather plain looking Famicom title, nothing special, nothing eye-popping, just perfectly average visual fare. In regards to sound, meh. While you are greeted with some faithful iterations of the classic Star Wars themes, it'd be a stretch to call them quality iterations of the John Williams composed score. I suppose I could cut NAMCO some slack considering this is from 1987, though it couldn't have killed them to do more songs to vary the audio a bit. I wouldn't mind listening to the same 2 songs for the whole game if they were decent, but in the case of Star Wars Famicom, they're just mediocre takes on the classic songs. The sound effects aren't too great either, and Darth Vader's breathing sounds funny. Sounds like little Annie upgraded his pod racer to a locomotive. Nobody's gonna get that. Overall, Star Wars for the Nintendo Family Computer from NAMCO is not very good. There are things I like about the game, such as the force powers, the variety in playstyles, and the use of allies to progress onwards, but the wonky controls, the questionable collision detection, and the difficulty curve brought about by poor gameplay mechanics and flaws does not make for an overall pleasant experience. All that aside, however, this game was definitely an experience. Not a good one, mind you, but something that will stick with me for a good long while. All in all, I'd say this is a somewhat below average game bordering on subpar mediocrity that isn't necessarily worth tracking down unless you're the hardest of hardcore Star Wars gamer fan person thing. It's not necessarily the worst thing to bear the Star Wars name, especially on 8-bit Nintendo.